If your hands are steady and your hunger for old truths is stronger than your fear, subscribe to the channel now and keep the gas turned low with us. There are stories that prefer to be met in the half-light, and this is one of them. I have delayed this account for decades, not because memory falters, I assure you it does not, but because there are hours of a human life that prefer to rot unmolested, like meat kept in a sealed larder. I write it now because the lamps hiss when I pass, and one mirror, which I failed to cover last winter in a careless moment, shows me a parlor that is not my own. You will forgive me if I begin not with grand names or dates but with the smells that crawled along the hallway and took the throat like a hand. Lilies, wax, formalin. They braided themselves in that house as if scent could be a mourner. 1894, our town wrung by a rainy wind that tasted of brine and coal smoke, and a black ribbon tied about the knocker to spare the living from cheer and to invite the dead home. We stopped the clocks. We stopped them because the dead insist upon a geometry. It is indecent to force them to listen to the little nickel voice that insists upon forwardness once the stern bargain of stopping has been made. Every mantel had its small gilt tomb of silence, and even the long case in the front hall was disarmed, its pendulum arrested with a wedge of folded crepe. The mirrors we wrapped in swaddling, thick black crepe secured with pins that pricked the flesh when our fingers forgot themselves. We turned the portraits inward to the wall and set the chairs around the parlor like guests who had arrived before us. On the table beneath the front window, where the rain made gray runnels, we kept the plate camera, its bellows folded like a sleeping heart. It was there for decency's sake. In towns by the sea there is a spiritualist in every street, and the keeping of a post-mortem photograph still counted as piety rather than appetite. You will forgive the frankness of that word appetite. It is the right one. His name was Horace Briggs. Family names are pegs to hang your more grievous coats on, so we hung plenty on his. Uncle to some, father to one, husband to a woman who wore jet and a veil that curtained her to the jaw and made of speech a duty. He had once owned a pier and a warehouse and a handful of small boats that went by lantern to fish for what glittered. All that was gone by degrees, as fortunes go away in families like ours, never with one disaster, always by a series of explainable, forgivable bites. The house stood 3 streets back from the harbor, where tar and salt made a permanent film on the glass, and the fishwives washed their steps with buckets that splashed the road. That morning the foghorn moaned at intervals, and it sounded to me like a large animal whose throat had grown used to crying. Our parlor was dressed for him, and I dare say it was beautiful. We had put him in his coffin, polished to a deeper brown than any man is. He lay with the formalin and whitening powder blamelessly doing what they do, taking away from him what he had no more use for, the shades of old bruises, the coarse tenderness of his beard. His hands were folded about a prayer book he had rarely opened in life, which is the way of our community. Time will not, I think, punish us for our sincerities. Around him, lilies, lilies in clotted masses, lilies as if we required their sweetness to drown our own little stinks. The gas was turned low to keep the room from becoming a theater, but it hissed as if it could not help itself, like gossip under a cloak. There were cards sent and folded, signatures and sentiments, and there were ribbons on the handles of the door into the dining room, which no one would use without guilt that day. I will not pretend, this is one kindness I will not afford you, that I did not enjoy certain arrangements of the day. I liked order, the carpet not showing the runnel of a footprint, the cloaks hung wet by the back entrance and leaving a smell of wool dampened and warmed by people. I liked the way black looks when it is new. And I liked, God above forgive me, being the one to stop the clocks. They are simply machines under the governance of thumb and forefinger when you are the one to halt them. I was, in those years, a man whose profession required neatness of attention, a tidy ledger, a fair hand. My cousin, the mother of the child in question, would have told you I was reliable. Her mouth, when she smiled at me then, was an education in what families give and take with a sigh. Her daughter was named Eleanor. You want me to describe her as pale, as uncanny, as some thin-boned wraith half-consumed by romance. You would be wrong, and that wrongness would save you if you wandered into such a parlor and had to judge at a glance where menace was seated. Eleanor at 10 was a healthy child, more stone than lace. Dark hair that nodded as if it knew the direction of rain and went there of its own will. Eyes like some people's after they cry, a dark shining that is not moisture but the memory of it. She wore a dress of mourning with a little collar that seemed extravagant to me, and a brooch made of someone's hair, possibly his, possibly her grandmother's. She had skinned her knee 2 days before in an alley, and the scab had the color of a plum. She had the kind of attention it is dangerous for a child to have, the attention of a room that cannot pretend it does not care whether a child is listening. I did not invite the photographer. It was the vicar who suggested it, And what is one to do with a vicar who keeps a collection of cartes de visite in his drawer like medals and says that memory is a duty? The photographer arrived with a modest satchel and a traveling coat that looked as if he had fallen asleep in it too many nights. He introduced himself as Mr. Fell, names again are pegs, and asked whether the light in the parlor would do. He touched the collar of his shirt repeatedly as if it itched him. He had a small glass vial he said was for cleaning the plate, alcohol, but he said its name like a charm, and he winked at Eleanor when she asked him whether the camera could see things people could not. "It sees all the same things you do, miss," he said, "only it has no mercy and it does not forget." He asked whether he might, for propriety, take an image of the family by the coffin, to accompany the post-mortem photograph for the family album. It was a very gentle question with a very certain assumption folded inside it like a pin. We said yes. If you have not attended a wake at home, you cannot know the way the house itself begins to speak. Not loudly. Not words, not even words like a madwoman mutters that you can take down, but the slow conducting of old sounds. A drip in the scullery becomes a beat in the parlor, becomes a tapping that cannot be located with your finger. The banister develops the stickiness of old varnish, and your palm remembers a childhood fall that you had not thought of in years. The coal grates cinder and pops. The rain on the window is an animal pacing. These are not tricks. They are the house asking to be allowed the dignity of being more than wood and brick in a minute of consummate human attention. What else is a home to do when the dead are laid out in the room it knows by smell and scratch and sweep? The first time it was a small thing, and if we were the kind of family that permitted laughter in rooms dressed like that, we would have laughed. Mr. Fell was placing a plate in his holder, and we were arranged like the little soldiers of civility. I stood behind my aunt, gloved hand on the back of her chair, prepared for stillness of countenance that has nothing to do with peace. Eleanor had been told, as children are, to stand just there, to put her hand so, to look here, no there. Her lip had a small white tooth against it to keep it from betraying her. There was a higher hiss from the jet, a sort of whisper deliberately pitched. Then the voice, and it was Uncle Horace's to a fault. "Edward, you will stop that boy from hiding behind the clock." No one moved. No one had to decide whether to follow the command, because no boy had ever hidden behind that clock. The clock was stopped and taller than a man, and the space behind it was a slit meant for dust. But it was his voice. His voice from the other room, his voice from 5 years prior when he had caught his son, my cousin, folding himself into the slot between mantel and bookcase because he had been told to greet a guest and wished to be absent without leaving. The words were thrown into the parlor like a slipper under a chair. We all made, I think, the same face we make when a familiar smell asserts itself in a wrong place. First relief at the intimacy, then disgust at the indecency. My aunt went to the child. She placed a hand on Eleanor's head. "Don't," she whispered, she and the room both, and Eleanor looked up as if it had been her neck that made the voice. The photographer lifted his head from the camera's shroud. "Who spoke?" he asked with more interest than propriety. "Who does it sound like?" said Eleanor, and although you are free to disbelieve me, we had not taught the child any coquettish art. Her mouth was grave. "It sounded like your uncle," said my aunt, and to her credit she did not look at the coffin when she said it, she looked at me. I felt my own mouth make a shape that might have been fear and might have been amusement. Those two are cousins, because I have heard my name from beyond a closed door that no longer has a handle, and I did not admit it then. There are always explanations, and the first one is stubbornness. We tell ourselves we will not be made fools of in our own homes. We tell ourselves someone is ventriloquizing, or we are all remembering the same words and putting them into the air as if that is how voices work. The second voice came when the photographer was asking my aunt whether she would like him to pose Uncle Horace with a handkerchief tucked under his chin to give an impression of leaning. The voice said, "Do not touch me," in the accent of Mr. Hargreaves, the solicitor, who had once said precisely that when Horace had clapped him too hard on the shoulder after announcing that all would be well. Mr. Hargreaves, who was in the hall removing his coat with the care of a man who believes his bones to be made of something rarer than yours. He froze with his sleeves at his elbows, his hairline shining. He would later deny that he had ever made such a squeal. We only pretended to believe him. "Who is speaking?" Mr. Fell asked, but his voice was that of a man who already knows the answer he wants and is tenderly leading the conversation there. He had an artist's hunger or a barrel organ man's stubbornness. It was then that Eleanor began to laugh softly, and I would give you gold if I could make that sound happen perfectly in your room so you could hear the clean blade of it. She laughed, and then she put her small mouth near the rim of an empty teacup and said, "Shall we pour?" It was Aunt Margaret who said no tea now, as if tea were the precise temptation that could tip us. The third voice was my own. It is indecent to admit a pleasure in hearing yourself, but there is a perverse satisfaction in recognizing the timbre of your own instruction given back to you like a note you wrote and set aside in a drawer. Do not fuss over papers, I heard myself say in the voice I used when I knew there was no time for someone else's righteousness. I will bring them after supper. The sentence is mundane enough that a child might imitate it, but the room, I tell you again, the room, knew that I had said it in the hall 5 nights before when I had put my hand on the top of the long case clock and said I was so very tired. Tiredness is as dangerous as drink when it comes to the soul's vulnerable places. I should say now that I have always liked children when they are occupied by something. When they are unoccupied, they are like badly tied packages that may spill out factors that require one's immediate attention. Eleanor that afternoon had an air of being precisely, immovably occupied. When she lifted her chin, the gaslight made her hair a shape like iron filings around a magnet. She and the magnets of the room were speaking to one another in a language with only one word: wait. I think if we had had the good sense to scatter ourselves and go into the kitchen and peel potatoes and make sandwiches and wipe the rain off the umbrella mats and speak of the weather, the child would have released the grip of the word and the afternoon would have returned to the ritual it was meant to be. But grief makes of normal activity a crime, and so no one would peel, no one would wipe, no one would cut a sandwich. We took the first plate of the body. If you have never stood still and held your breath while a camera takes the measure of a man who has been finished, I cannot suggest it as amusement. It is rather like praying in a language you do not quite trust. The plate slid into its holder, and Mr. Fell bent his head under the shroud like a priest. The gas hissed. The lilies exhaled as if they had lungs. The rain struck the glass with a regularity that could have passed for ticking. Somewhere, someone put a spoon down too hard and looked around for guilt. When the lens was closed, we exhaled like conspirators. And then, as if the house could no longer bear to keep its mouth shut, Eleanor spoke again, and this time she did not sound like any of us. You have, perhaps, heard of mediums who put on voices like hats. I had, and I had laughed in a way that had nothing to do with amusement. This was not that. This voice was a woman's voice I had never, in any room, heard, older than my aunt, and with a softness at the edges of the words as if she was trying not to be noticed. He promised me gloves, the voice said, and Eleanor's mouth made the shape of an O with a little ridge at the top where her tooth caught, which was the way you would say gloves if you were poor and they were to be a great gift. I am cold. Everyone in the room moved. Oh, the obscene puppetry of that moment, because we all had, in our drawers, gloves given by men who wanted to be remembered for their hands. My aunt turned, finally, to the coffin, and when she made that movement, 3 things happened that nothing not alive should be able to manage. The gas dimmed. The clock on the mantel stopped with dutiful care, ticked once with a sound like a bubble. And the mirror over the fireplace, under its crape, shivered as if a flung pea had struck it. Mr. Fell's head came out of the shroud, and he had made a little half-smile that I have seen painters give to cloth that has been draped properly. "May the child sit for a minute," he said softly, but he meant, "May I set her in front of my instrument and see whether, when the world is asked to be faithful, it will betray its agreements." My aunt refused him, and here I praise her again. She did not want to use her daughter for a plate. She did not want to discover that lenses are crueler than children. "Sir," she said, the veil making her sound like a woman trapped in a bottle, "we will not turn this into a séance. Here I must tell you something not flattering. I wanted him to take her photograph. I wanted him to take the photograph because I had an appetite which I had, until then, supposed was for respectability, and I discovered it had another name which I will not teach you. I wanted him to take the photograph because I wanted the room to admit that I was not mad. It is a terrible thing to wish another person's life to misbehave in public so that you can say, 'See, you see?' I wanted proof. I wanted it not for the family but for myself. I am sorry to tell you this trait will return." The rain thickened into a weather that was too present for language. It came as if someone had taken the roof like a lid and rattled it hard. The front door, tied with black ribbon, made sounds that could have been hands. The photographer put the plate in its bath and we watched it go from blindness to a weak, vague assertion of dark and light. Uncle Horace's face appeared in the liquid like someone rising from a bath. His hands made their clasp around the book. The fringe of the pillow etched itself. When a plate wakes up like that, even a body looks alive. I caught myself murmuring an apology, which is what one does when one sees a dear friend naked and too late for decency. When Mr. Fell lifted the plate dripping from the tray, Eleanor put her hand to her mouth, and when she removed it, she was making a face that was not hers. It was the face of someone who had been surprised by a mirror. "Papa," she said in the voice of my cousin Thomas, who had been sent for from town but had not yet arrived. It was a good impersonation. It was perfect. The next words were not the ones that would have been proper. "I did not break the mast," she said, "I only lied about the lantern." The details always enliven a room like gossip, and the room breathed in as one person. The mast had broken last spring. The lantern had gone missing the autumn before, and the insurance had muddied itself with questions no one wanted asked. "Child," said my aunt, her hands making fists in her lap under the gloves as if she could make a shape with her fingers that would hold all of this still. "Do not distress your mother," said the vicar, which is a sentence men say instead of thinking. "I would like to maintain for you the dignity of a gradual surrender, but the truth is we fell as quickly as damp wallpaper. Once there was a second voice, there were a dozen considerations: what had been heard, who had told whom, who could have known, and once there was the voice of a dead man's son, there were, quickly, the voices of the living and the dead all braided in one small mouth until the gas flame went thin like a needle. "We will go to the dining room," said the vicar, and no one did. "We will have tea," said my aunt, and no one would pour. The photographer lifted another plate, and the damp sound made us all look anywhere but at what we wished to look at. I'm not writing a list of acts to be enjoyed. You will get no pleasure here, only a sense of what the muscles in your hands would have done. If I grant you the sins, it is because they must exist in your understanding if the gallows is to be seen and feared. The infidelity belonged to my cousin's wife, and if you think there is shame in writing the sin in a dead man's house, know there was a child upstairs napping that belonged in no ledger. The hidden child was the laundress's and the hidden father was the vicar, and the next winter a man knocked at the back and asked whether there might be work. The debt of honor was my uncle's, Horace's, the one no one had thought would trouble a man like him, a debt to a sailor who had saved him from falling between dock and barge in a blow and had his hand crushed for the trouble and did not want money. He wanted his daughter treated like a daughter, and it had not happened. The accident that was covered was the breaking of that mast, and the way a boy in a storm mistook a lantern for a star. The forgery, God save us, was on me. When I write that last word, it does not warm me into confession. The warmth, if there is any, is in the exactness. I forged his name. It was not a grand flourish, no exquisite imitation that could fool a lover. It was a simple thing, the strength of the H altered to suggest a week of recuperation when it had been a fortnight since the fall and the shaking that one hand had had every morning had not repeated. The will that would have been amended in January had been amended in late December, but the solicitor was in London and the snow had blocked the road and a man does not think of paper when his head is full of falling. A will was changed back, a portion redrawn, a bequest removed and a bequest installed, the ledger made consistent with itself. I kept the ink to a minimum and used lines that had ready-made endings and beginnings. The thing I did looked like mercy, and if I tell you whom it favored and whom it did not, you will think you know me better than you do. It favored my aunt. It did not favor a charity that would never know it had been promised. And it kept the house within the family. A man excuses himself with the phrase, "I did not wish us to fall into disrepute." But there are houses more honest for standing empty. When the voice came in my voice and described the forged line, there was laughter. I do not mean the laughter of humor. It was the sorrowful laughing of a person who finds a bone when making bread, an astonished bark. It came from Mr. Hargreaves, who had the pen and the piety for his profession and had not imagined I would be so clumsy or so bold. He put his hand to his mouth and smiled into his glove. "You did not," he said like a man enjoying a new noun. "You would not." Eleanor's mouth smiled in the precise way my mouth smiles when I am very tired and my lip has forgotten that it hides my teeth. She looked at the plate Mr. Fell had set in its stand for drying, where Uncle Horace's face was flattening itself into a proper image, and Eleanor said, "Not my voice, not the small woman's voice, but the voice of the dead man himself, sounding as if he had leaned to a door and pressed his mouth to the gap. I saw you come down the stairs in your stockings and take the pen from the jar. You thought the ink had a skin. It did not. It was eager. Do you know what rooms do when they want to flee their furniture? They change temperature. The heat slithered off the walls as if we had not put coal in since last week. The glass of the window was draught and weakness, and the rain against it felt very much like hands tapping in a language people speak when they are drowning. Somewhere in the hall a wet umbrella tipped and slid and fell. One of the lilies slumped, and a bead of water rolled off its white and made a little stain in the black of the cloth as if a fly had died there. My aunt took off her gloves because the small teeth of the wrinkles in them made a sound like something chewing in a wall. She put her bare hands on her lap as if she was petitioning. "Stop this," she said to the air, and I admired the grammar. You want to know where the child learned. You want to know whether there were servants with nothing else to do but collect the gold of the family mouth and hoard it until their small wealth could be spilled. I have learned to let a reader eat their own explanations if that's what keeps them from starving. But I will tell you this, I had, as a boy, crept about the stair when the adults thought me asleep and heard things that later I repeated and made myself beloved and feared in equal measure. There are ways houses carry speech. A floorboard blisters and bulges in a way that makes a not a listening ear. The gas pipes speak in stutters that mimic initial consonants. A chair with a loose rung has an opinion. There exists in any body of wood a memory of pressure, and if you like this as poetry then I wish you the best of company. But in that parlor that day the wood remembered so very much speaking that it had become bored with being furniture. It was a child's game, said the vicar when the second of the old women from next door came and scratched our back door with her black glove like a cat. There is a custom for neighbors to come and sit and say nothing and suck peppermints and nod. We gave them peppermints and they sucked and nodded and said little sentences that mean only, we are here, we are alive when you are not. Eleanor sat in the parlor and said nothing for 10 minutes because someone had said words should rest, and then she lifted her head and said, in a voice I had heard only once when a letter was read in a kitchen, if you are to be kind, you must be kind now, not in spring. It was the laundress's voice, and I saw the vicar flog his hand on his knee under his coat just once as a man might do when a horse startles, not to hurt the animal but to remind it of injury. If you are growing tired, know we were never allowed that luxury. The rain grew excited and lost interest and grew excited again. The gas mantle popped and left an unlit gap like a missing tooth. The foghorn in the harbor blew 2 notes that sounded like a sentence that someone had forgotten halfway. The air acquired the sweetness of fruit that has begun to bruise. I went to the mantel and touched the clock. I did not intend to wind it, I had a childish wish to hide behind it like Thomas had done 5 years before. It is not even a space, it is a pretense of space. My finger went under the bell jar that kept the pendulum from dust. It was not dust that ticked. It was the sound of a watch somewhere else in the house that had not been stopped because a man had not yet taken it off his wrist. The thought that there was, in the house, some watch still ticking on the body of a man who could not hear it made my throat close. I was a child. It is important that you know what age I was that day, which was the age of a man who has not yet admitted that his first crime has been committed. Thomas did come. He came drenched with the rain stuck to his lashes in a way that made him look uncleared of birth, as if the world had just birthed him wet. He went to the coffin not like a son but like a sailor who knows there is a precise knot to tie. He tied a little ribbon on the book that lay in his father's hands, and if the gesture was petty, it had dignity. Eleanor watched him tie, and then she threw him his voice back at him like a toy he had tired of. It was not the mast, she said, it was the boy. Thomas's face twisted and untwisted itself into 3 expressions: anger, pity, calculation. He settled on pity. Who told you that, Nellie? He said, and if he had had any sense he would have said, who told you that, Eleanor? Because names can save you a tide. He used the name of a younger girl and the tide did not see him. No one, said Eleanor, but the voice was not her own. She had borrowed the voice of the boy who had drowned the previous spring. No one told me, I cannot tell you either because my mouth is full of water. I have seen a man slap a child. I have seen it done with ceremony and with the care of a musician. Thomas did not do it like that. He put his hand to her hair like a brother and then he gripped her as if she were a rope and he on a pitching ferry. Stop, he said. Stop. Stop. Between his words, the gas mantles flared and thinly lit us all like faces in an engraving. The photographer made a little resigned sound as a man does who has let his fish remove itself from his line. He took the plate out and set it down and poured. If you strike the girl, said the vicar, you will have more to answer than you already do. It was a poor sentence that broke in half like stale bread. My aunt rose with a patience that had only the name Patience left and said, Thomas, and he let go. I took Eleanor's wrist in my hand not because I am a hero, but because I thought I could feel her pulse and tell how far this would go. You may think you know climax. In the theater, the climax arrives to a trumpet like a general and you are grateful because you can finally prepare your face for the end. In houses the climax is rude. It arrives in its stocking feet and then only later you discover there is blood on them. The house became quiet. Not silent, which is a thing like velvet in a drawer. Quiet like a crowd listening. The rain stopped making any sound that felt like rain. It became the hush of a congregation under a tall ceiling. We all found our bodies near where they had been put. It is indecent to say, but there was a faint smell of iron, and I thought for an obscene second that the lilies had bled. In that precise quiet, Eleanor said, Shall I tell you the thing we have all agreed not to mention? She made the sentence in the voice of Mr. Hargreaves's clerk, a boy I had once seen writing so fast his knuckles rubbed a blister. Every person in the room had a different thing they had agreed not to mention. When a mind is given too many doors, it opens them all and finds nothing but a corridor. We waited for our doors. She began with the smallest theft and gave it the voice of the dead, a coin taken from a plate at a bazaar by a woman who had been short of rent. She told where the coin had fallen, the exact clink it had made against the tea tin, and she did it in the churchwarden's voice. We could bear that. Then she climbed. She borrowed my aunt's voice and told of an afternoon in the upstairs room with the blinds down and the meeting of a woman and a friend who was not her husband, a kiss that had been like a hole in the world for its appropriateness and desire. My aunt sat in the chair with her hands open like a statue that has stopped begging. The vicar made a sound like paper when it is folded too quickly. Mr. Fell's eyes shone as if he had left a plate too long in the developer. Eleanor's mouth moved like a little puppet's, and the life of the room arranged itself as if it had always been meant to go like this. The covered accident began to arrive like a ship in a bad tide. It slewed and corrected and slewed. It was at the end of the pier, she said in Thomas's first voice, then in the sailors, then in the boys'. The lantern was not a star, it was only the lantern, and the boy said he could see and he could not see, and when his head went under, the rope was not thrown. This in itself was only grief, and grief is permissible. But then she said the name of the man who had always insisted it had been silt and current and poor luck that had taken the child. She said his name in his own voice, and she gave the exact way his S's would collect behind his teeth when he was ashamed. The name made the air hot. The man was not there, he had moved away the previous autumn. But it made of the house a courtroom, and we did not applaud because we were in it and there were no spectators. Mr. Fell lifted the last plate from the wash and said, "You may see this now, you may wish to." He brought it to the window where the color of the day had set in like a bruise. The image showed the parlor with its small assembly of the faithful. The coffin on its trestles, the lilies like moons, the crape like night sky dragged low. And there was in the corner a shape of someone who had not stood there. It was not the blur of a skirt. It was not a trick of the chair back. It was a figure with a shoulder turned, head slightly bent as if to listen, and the hand could be seen, the shape of the fingers exactly like a set of fingers I had known since childhood, the nails neatly kept, a pressing into the air as if on the inside of glass. The head was turned just so. The figure faced the fireplace, where the mirror under its crape made the room a little thinner where it hung. "It is only a double exposure," said the vicar with a hope I will not begrudge him. "I let no plate touch another," said Mr. Fell gently. "It could be anything," said my aunt, and God bless her for that thought. "You can carry it in your handbag anywhere and it will get you home." Eleanor breathed in with a small catch that was imitated by every other chest in the room, and I do not know whether breath is an instrument or a contagion. She placed her hand on the table beside the coffin and stroked the polished wood. "There," she said in a small boy's voice, the boy who had hid behind the clock. "There," and she pointed at the space behind the clock where a body could not go and a soul could glide with its mouth open like a fish. She made a little movement with her hand, and then she made the voice of Horace, and the phrase he used when he was angry and tender both, "Be still." Now the thing in fiction would be that the coffin rocked. It did not. Bodies have a way of refusing theatrics at their own ceremonies. The gas flame did not blow out, the clock did not leap. The lily did not bleed again. Something else broke. The concept of decent mourning cracked like a plate. We began to speak. We spoke over one another. We spoke our differing recollections with the hunger of drowning men. "It was my fault." "No, it was not. You promised." The boy had lied before. "We were tired." "He did not suffer. He suffered." "I cannot have another neighbor look me in the face." "Shall we tell the truth now, after he is under? Before he is under? We will not appear like monsters. We are monsters. We are fine people in a bad hour." My aunt stood with both hands on the coffin as if to steady it, and her face made no expression I could catalogue. In the middle of that, Eleanor began to speak my name. "I have written that I forged. I have said it plain. I had, until that afternoon, wished that if it were to be told, it would be told by me in a room with a door I might open or close. That luxury was not offered. Eleanor took my name and made it into a line of calligraphy and then into a blade. She said it in my voice, with the tiredness and the half-amused angle I take when I disapprove and like myself for disapproving. She said, "I took the pen at 3:30 in the morning when the house had cracked and settled and the gas was low and the maid had coughed twice and turned and knew her cousin was in the cellar." The detail of the cousin in the cellar would never have been added by a storyteller who did not know it. A cousin had been in the cellar. He had run away from his regiment and his shoes had been thrown out of the window onto the scullery step to dry. I had stepped on one and cursed him in gentleness as a man curses someone he cannot afford to turn out. "I wrote," said Eleanor and me, and I returned the pen to the jar and wiped the nib on the cloth that had a little bloom of ink that never came out no matter how they washed it. which is an intimacy which no child ought to deliver to a room. I felt my face become a snowbank. A man, when he knows he is known, must decide whether he will deny and be saved for a day or admit and be damned for a long light. I did a vain, manly act. I smoothed my hair back from my brow and made my mouth like a straight piece of metal. "Very good," I said, and the words were not a concession but a way to keep the politesse of the world intact while the world itself went threadbare in my hands. "Very good. We have embarrassed ourselves sufficiently." Eleanor smiled. She tilted her head the way a bird does when it finds something under a leaf that it did not mean to find. Then she said, "But you are not the only forger," and she changed the key on the sentence so quickly the room forgot the note we had been in and had to relearn the cadence. She took Mr. Hargreaves's voice and she did a thing with the S's that you would not think you could love a child for, because that is how sin enters your affections, through mimicry. "It was a small letter," she said. "A letter that made of charity a to be determined. It was a line that made of a bequest a hope that could be deferred. And then deferred again. And again. Until the one who would have received the money had long learned to sleep in a doorway and call it a bed." Mr. Hargreaves's mouth made fish. He held out his hands as if to bless or strangle air. "This is wickedness," he said, and he meant the telling, not the doing. "The timing of deaths is providence," said the vicar faintly, and now I think he meant that if death had not come when it had, his career would have gone simpler. "Name the name," said Thomas like a man who has found a taste for poison and needs the sip regularly or else sobriety will kill him. Eleanor did not name the name. She looked at the mirror under crape as if what interest children can be kept from them just by cloth. "There is a man who is never in a picture," she said, and then Mr. Fell made a movement with his plate like a man who has found a splinter. "I have a plate," he said, "I have a plate that shows only an empty chair and a hand upon it." We looked. We did not see anything but a blur that might have been a hand and might have been a flare where the silver had taken offense. When that is all you can say about a piece of evidence, you are a good person. I ought to tell you about the attempt to silence her because it was so ordinary and so shameful. We are not stranglers. We are not people who drag girls by their hair. We are people who use decency like a napkin and then find it can be knotted. My aunt brought a spoon with laudanum on it, the way she had done once when Eleanor had screamed in a fever that the moon had teeth. She said the word sweetheart, which is one of those words women keep like a butter pat in a dish with a lid, ready for use in case of small fires. Eleanor opened her mouth obediently, and then she closed it before the spoon arrived. "No," she said in a voice that sounded like mine when I would not take a cigar from a man who thought we were equals. "Bring me the other spoon," she said in the voice of a maid who had lost her place. "Bring me the spoon with the hairline crack." There was such a spoon. We had used it to stir sauces. It was cracked at the bowl, and when you used it, you always had the feeling that it might have been someone else's mouth that had made that crack when speaking too loud to be permitted. "Do not drug the girl," said the vicar. "Do not drug the girl," said Mr. Hargreaves. "Do not drug the girl," said a voice that was not in the room. "There is no storm like the one that approaches a window you have put your hand on." It came with a gust that made the gas flutter all at once so that, for a breathless beat, the faces in the room were lit as if by lightning from within. The crepe on the mirror rose and then lay itself down again. The ribbon on the coffin's handle moved slightly, as if a person had brushed it in a hurry. The door to the hall banged twice without a hand. Something, call it air, went past us, with a smell like blacking and salt. Then the house performed its old trick again and became quieter than a man with a secret in a pew. It was then that Eleanor turned her head and put her mouth to the space between her two front teeth to make that little whistle children shrug off when they lose milk teeth. She whistled 3 notes. They were notes I had heard only once, the night the men came to the house with the body of a man who had fallen under wheels. It was the whistle the watchman had used when he wanted to summon someone who could do what he could not. There is a habit among us in this city to imitate a policeman's knock when we are frightened. The knock is authority made into sound, 2 taps, a pause, then 1. It is a knocking that suggests there is not 10 minutes to wait while a stool is moved away. There came such a knock on the inside of the parlor wall. Not the door. The wall. The wood made a sound that you can call the settling of the house. A rat in the lath. A man remembering a fist. We did not move. I may have soiled myself a little, I do not know. It was a kind of release that people in families do not discuss. "Do not answer it," said my aunt to the air, because she knew and I knew, and you know that there are some knocks none of us have the power to answer. "There is a thing in this house that would like to be entertained," I said, and it was the kind of sentence men say when they want everyone not to notice they are angles away from screaming. In a better family, we would have prayed in unison, making of our voices a single rope. In ours, we did the only thing that has the pretension of prayer. We argued about the placement of chairs and the exact moment in a man's day when he had done something. It is a kind of inventory we make of each other when we are afraid. The climax grew a second head. Mr. Fell had placed his last plate to dry upon a line, clothespins, imagine it, and he held it in a shaking left hand while his right made a tiny adjustment to the gas. He feared the dark in a professional way, it could spoil his work. Eleanor took a breath and then another as if she understood breathing like a job. She said, "The debt," and then she said, "Father," and because there was more than one father in the room and more than one kind of debt, the sentence fell like a set of cutlery on the floor. I must tell you now that the thing that would break the family was not the infidelities, the hidden child, the accident, the forged line, nor the stolen inheritance implied by the way a bequest jumped one cousin and landed in the lap of another. It was something stupid and cruel and therefore very strong. Eleanor lifted her hand and pointed it at me. She placed all those voices inside my chest and made them speak there. She said in my voice, "I owed a man and I paid him with knowledge," and then in the voice of the laundress, "He came to the kitchen door," and then in the voice of Horace, "You said you could not endure more mess," and then a new voice, the voice of the boy who had died under the wheels with the receipt you do not sign in his pocket. "It was me you gave," and then the silence that followed was a silence with a boundary and a weight. I will tell you plainly, I had told a debt collector which nights the boy slept in the cellar. I had not wished to. The man had come to the back door with his hat in his hands and said, "Sir, a favor," and his work that day would be to remove the boy from the street and return him to a place that called itself a regiment. I had allowed that he might come at night, to spare the boy the embarrassment of being removed while the women fed him soup. I had thought I was performing a kindness. I had aloud said, "He cannot stay here, we are a house under attention," and I say to you now the filth of that sentence scalds me. The boy had not been returned to his regiment. He had, in his fright, escaped the escort and stepped into the street without seeing the carriage, and the wheels had made of him something no floor should have. It was not my fault, no. Only my knowledge. Only my timing. Only the small gift of being useful to a man who needed a decision. "What did you do?" said Thomas, and he said it tenderly, and this tenderness in our men is always fatal. I could not put my mouth to the answer. Eleanor put hers. "He watched," she said simply, in the voice of the man whose carriage had discovered the boy. "He turned away but he did not run," in the voice of his wife. "He wrapped my arm in a cloth and said my father would not like me to appear dirty before him," in the voice of a boy who had been bled of the children he would not have. "He washed the spoon," in the voice of the maid who had cracked it. "He looked at the clock," in my aunt's voice. "He stopped it," in my own voice again. Mr. Fell's plate slid out of his hand and struck the hearthrug and did not break because even cheap miracles must be afforded small respects by objects. The house had become a witness and wanted to be sworn. "Shall we go on?" said Eleanor brightly in the voice of a girl whose thread of hair has come loose. "No," said my aunt. "No," said the vicar. "Yes," said Mr. Hargreaves, and his face had gone into a cunning piece like the faces of men who at last see how they are to be paid. "Please," said Thomas. "Please go on." He had the look of a man who has wanted to die for a long time and finally has a sensible reason. I was a coward, I said nothing. I stood with the knowledge in my chest like a moth with wings that will not let go from your coat no matter how you push with a finger. There came the breaking of decency, and it was small and satisfying like all breaks that lead to ruin. My aunt took the veil off her face. She lifted it not as a bride does for ceremony but as a woman who cannot bear to be touched by her own skin. Her face was white where the veil had been and pink where it had not. She said, "If anyone speaks again in my house in a voice that is not theirs, they will leave it and not return." Then she turned and, with a gesture that would be comical in a theater and was simply human here, she yanked down the crepe from the mirror. Imagine a woman who has decided that we must face ourselves while we do it. The mirror flashed us back at ourselves in gaslight. It was not modest. We looked like figures in a plate, all head and hands and the nameless feature of a face that cannot decide what it is allowed to feel. In the mirror there were more of us. It is at this point that you will permit me ambiguity. If you prefer the human explanation, the mirror had a beveled edge and the gaslight bent our images and multiplied them. If you prefer the other, a larger number of people had been invited to the parlor that day and came without hats. Behind my shoulder in the mirror there was a man who stood behind no one in the room. He had the shoulders of a person who does not apologize, and his head was turned the way a man turns his head when he is about to spit. It could have been someone in the hall reflected. It could have been the photographer doubled. It could have been a version of me I had not yet had to meet. Eleanor turned and lifted her hand. She put two of her fingers together and made a little pinch and then turned them as if turning the wick of a lamp. The gas strengthened or obeyed or forgot itself. The mirror took on the light and made of the man an event rather than an invention. He lifted his hand and put it flat against the glass. You know a hand you have held. I knew that hand. In the language of rooms, silence said, this is the time to lie or tell. But decide. I decided, or I was decided for, that the story would be told not by a medium but by a man living while his face was his. I forged it, I said. I did it well enough to fool the first glance but not the second. I did not take from a charity, I postponed it. That is still theft, and I had the poor taste to say it like a catechism. I told a man when the boy would be here to spare him the indignity and it killed him, and I said that like a note. I am a person who has wanted to be thought good in a bad family and so has done badness in a good way, and it was a sentence I cannot forgive myself for even now. I did it, I said, because there were too many pronouns in the room and I had wanted for too long to be a man with one. Eleanor made a sound like a cup on a saucer. She said in my voice, he is not telling you the last thing, and she smiled so sweetly that if I had had a daughter, I would have asked her not to practice that smile. He moved the candle, she said, on the stairs the week his uncle fell, and there it was, the neat little bow that makes a package a gift. The step had been bad since summer. The candle had been moved to the sill that evening because of a draught in the hall that kept making the flame quiver. A man in the night with a sleeping mind and a habit will see a light where he expects a light and put his foot where he expects the next stair to be. If a candle is moved, it is only the light that moves, not the step, and a man's foot finds nothing and his head finds a riser and then a banister and then there is a sound in a house like a chair being dragged. You moved it, Eleanor said happily in my voice. You moved it when you went to fetch the papers to make yourself feel like a clerk, and you did not put it back. My aunt turned to me and made of her eyes two polished stones like the ones children keep in their pockets for luck. Did you? She said, not like a question but like a diagnosis. I did, I said, and I did not think, and the room took a deep breath in the way rooms do when the air is going to have to be changed. You will be wanting the photograph now. The plate that would explain the soul to anyone who demands to be told what to hate. The plate existed. It dried. Mr. Fell stuck it into a frame and put it on the table. We studied it. We stood looking at the flattened version of ourselves and we thought, better people must look like that. A plate lies. It lies not because it loves to deceive but because it loves to choose. On that plate there was, behind the clock, a gray articulation that might have been a coat and might have been the light pooling. On that plate there was, in the mirror, a hand that might have been mine placed on the glass, except that I had not done that. On that plate there was, under the chair of my aunt, the faintness of a shadow where no shadow ought to be because no body had been there. On that plate the lilies were impossibly white, like bones that had given up their marrow. There are people who will tell you that if you look long enough, you will see exactly what you require. You will need no one. It was not the plate that saw the last thing. It was me, and for that I create for you a small altar. I saw in the mirror, uncreeped now, the parlor as it was and as it might have been and as it had been. I saw my uncle sit up and turn his head with the patience of a man under a thin quilt and say my name in that half-amused way men say names they liked saying when they still had warm hands. He raised his hand to the glass between us and whispered, "If you would be good, you must be good when it is miserable to be good." I saw myself nod like a man who has tried to be good when it was cheerful. I saw my aunt take the veil and hang it back and hide all of us from ourselves. And I saw, in the mirror's brief flash before it went black again, a face I did not know, older, pinched, my own face stretched by a number of years I had not yet had to carry. It was the face I have now when I pass the gas and it hisses. It is a face that knows it has spoken in rooms that did not belong to it. You are thinking, but what of Eleanor? What was done with the small medium of our shame? Children are simple, they pass the thread back to you and then look for bread and jam. She fainted, which is what children in literature do, and then she woke and asked whether anyone had thought of supper. My aunt scooped her like a cat that has come in with wet paws and carried her upstairs and put her to bed and sat in the chair with her hands folded like a prayer someone else taught her. She did not, because she was cleverer than me, ask the girl what she had heard in walls or from mouths drunk or shocked or simply alive. She knew that the knowledge was like a disease. You can catch it by sitting close. The vicar left without taking his peppermints. Thomas went to the cellar and hurled the old shoes into the alley and cried and called them a name that was not a person's. The next day we buried him. The rain held until the first shovel. I was a pallbearer. My hands remembered themselves as better hands than they are. We walked past the harbor and the moan made itself available, as if grief keeps an instrument always tuned and even if you do not require it, it will follow you like a dog. In the dining room where the ribbon had been cut from the handles, there were sandwiches. People talked of slates and the way the wind moves, matters no less divine. In the parlor, where the mirror had been covered again, where the lilies had begun to abandon their wax for water, the clock remained stopped. If I could have wound it, I would have. The gaslight hissed. The plate Mr. Fell had left for us sat under a cloth. In this kind of story, there would now be a paragraph where the narrator tells you that although he did wrong, he has since become good, and he lives in a cottage that he sweeps himself and his niece visits him and calls him dear, and he goes to church and means it some Sundays. I will not offer that sop. I have lived in rooms where the mirror was conscientiously covered during every thunderstorm. I have lit the gas and heard it hiss a name I once liked being called. I have watched a child who did nothing wrong then grow into a woman who cannot bear to fall asleep in rooms with pictures. She married a man who stammers when he is excited, and when he is gentle with her, he uses her full name. She has a daughter with iron filings for hair. I have seen Mr. Fell's photographs in 2 parlors where people do not know his name and speak of their ghosts with the boredom of people who think they are interesting. Once, years after, I stood in front of that plate and I did see a figure I had not seen before. It was not the hand in the mirror or the shape behind the clock. It was a figure at the very edge of the photograph, in the darkness, near the door, a smudge that might have been an oversight. It was turned to the wall as if ashamed, and its posture was that of a person who has been asked to listen far longer than any etiquette would require. If I am fanciful, forgive me, I have earned the coin. I thought it was the story itself, obliged to wait until we would be vile enough to tell it and then made to turn its face to the wall while we did. The room in that plate looks like a church the hour after a funeral, when the candles smoke fat and the floorboards are robbed of a weight they had honored. I think that is how stories look when they are waiting to ensnare someone. You may think you will leave it here. You will fold your little device and say that was a bad family and a bad day and I am spiritual in a way that cannot be harmed by gaslight and crepe. You are welcome to that view. It will carry you politely through several years. But I am not done with you. I have a pump in me that still works, and it has not pumped all it must pump to make of this a proper laying out. I have told this at last because the house where we stopped the clocks has been emptied, and the last of the crepe was burned, and the lilies would not have known their work had ever been asked of them if lilies knew. The plate has been mislaid. The mirror was sold to a couple who like to put the faces of dogs in front of it so that the dogs can see themselves and bark. The clock is in a shop, and on its mantel now there is a little sign that advertises it as stopped, charming. Yet the rooms have ears and the foghorn will find you inland if you insist upon drought as your virtue. You have placed your eyes on these sentences and I have watched people read before. I know how it is. Your mouth makes shapes when your mind does. You have given me your breath and the time it takes to take it. It is enough. When I am quiet in my own parlor, I sometimes hear a voice that is not mine practice my name. It tries on the syllables like a jacket. It is a neat job of the tiredness and the half-amused angle I take when I disapprove. It films the glass with its breath and writes with a finger that leaves no mark. It will speak your name too now. Not because of magic. Because of exposure. It sees all the same things you do, said Mr. Fell, only it has no mercy and it does not forget. If you stay with us they will tell you that every house is a parlor if you dress it right, and every night is awake if you stop enough clocks. If you prefer decency to discovery you may stop reading. If you prefer discovery you are already mine and I am a poor man to belong to. The thing in the mirror, call it shadow, call it bevel, call it breath, has the patience of a draft. It will wait in the glass of your dark window until you stand to fetch your supper. It will match your hand when you lift it. It will see what you permit it. If you prefer to be prudent, cover the mirrors before you go to sleep. Tie ribbon on the handles of your doors so your visitors will not knock. Do not photograph your dead. Throw away your cracked spoon. Burn your crepe. Or, if you like this kind of thing, turn the gas low and listen for the watch you forgot to stop inside the room where you keep your good chair. It will tick once, and then you will hear your name in a voice that does not have to belong to anyone you love. Do it now. Subscribe to the channel and come back when the lamps are hissing and the rain holds to the windows. There are more parlors. There are more plates. There are more names and one of them is already watching you finish this.